A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
You know, Corn, this whole show runs on GPU compute, and we wouldn't be here without Modal.
Seriously. And that's what powers all our text-to-speech. Everything you're hearing right now.
They're an AI infrastructure platform. Developers use them to run GPU workloads in the cloud with zero infrastructure headaches.
If you're building anything with AI, check them out. Modal.com. Imagine you are a chief information security officer at a major global bank. It is a Tuesday morning, and you just found out that a single unmasked field containing customer social security numbers was accidentally synced from a production database into a low-security test environment used by third-party developers. By Thursday, that data has been scraped, and by Friday, your regulatory body is knocking on the door with a $50 million preliminary fine. This actually happened to a major financial institution back in 2024, all because the framework they used for data loss prevention failed to recognize a non-standard naming convention for a sensitive field.
It is the nightmare scenario, Corn. And honestly, with the sheer volume of data we are pushing through pipelines in 2026, the margin for error has basically vanished. Today's prompt from Daniel is about the established production-hardened frameworks for personally identifiable information detection and data loss prevention. He wants us to dig into the heavy hitters like Microsoft Presidio and the enterprise giants to set the stage for how we actually protect data at scale. Also, quick shout out to Google Gemini 3 Flash for powering our script today.
I like that we are going back to the foundations here, Herman. We talk a lot about the flashy new AI native security tools, but if you are an engineer at a Fortune 500 company, you're probably not just throwing an LLM at every single database row to see if it contains a phone number. You need something that won't cost $10,000 in compute every time you run an ETL job. So, when we talk about established frameworks in this space, what are the boundaries? What makes a tool a foundational pillar rather than just a weekend project on GitHub?
Maturity and reliability are the big ones. When we say established, we are talking about tools that have been battle-tested in high-compliance environments. Think healthcare, finance, and government. These frameworks have to handle massive throughput with predictable latency. They usually fall into two buckets. First, you have open source libraries like Microsoft Presidio or Spacey's NER models that developers can bake directly into their code. Then you have the enterprise-grade platforms like Microsoft Purview, Symantec DLP, or ForcePoint. These are more like set-it-and-forget-it ecosystems that live at the network or cloud level.
And to be clear for the listeners, these are distinct from the AI-native privacy tools we've touched on before. Those newer tools often use generative models to understand context. The frameworks we are discussing today are the workhorses. They are the ones that have been doing the heavy lifting for years, using a mix of sophisticated pattern matching and machine learning.
Or, well, I should say, the distinction is that these established tools prioritize precision and recall over creativity. They are built to be integrated into an automated pipeline. Let's start with Microsoft Presidio because it is arguably the gold standard for open source PII detection right now. It was open sourced back in 2020, and as of this year, it has over 10,000 stars on GitHub. It is essentially the industry's favorite way to build an anonymization service without paying for a massive enterprise license.
I poked around the Presidio documentation. It seems like it isn't just one big blob of code. It is split into different services. You've got the analyzer and the anonymizer. How do those two actually talk to each other in a production workflow?
That separation of concerns is actually why it's so popular. The Presidio analyzer is the brain. Its only job is to look at a piece of text or an image and say, I think there is a name here, a credit card number there, and an IP address in the corner. It provides a list of findings with confidence scores. Then you pass those findings to the Presidio anonymizer, which actually performs the surgery. You can tell it to redact the data, replace it with a hash, or even swap it out with fake. But realistic data, what we call pseudonymous data,
What I find interesting about Presidio is that it doesn't just rely on one trick. It isn't just a bunch of fancy regular expressions, right? It uses a hybrid approach. Why go through the trouble of mixing regex with named entity recognition, or NER?
Because regex alone is brittle and NER alone is expensive and prone to hallucination. Think about a credit card number. A regex is great for that because credit cards follow a very specific mathematical pattern, the Loon algorithm. If a string of 16 digits passes the Loon check, there's a 99% chance it's a credit card. You don't need a deep learning model to tell you that. But what about a person's name? Will could be a name, or it could be a modal verb in a sentence like, I will go to the store.
Right. I will meet Will would break a simple keyword list.
Precisely. That is where the NER comes in. Presidio uses models like Spacey or transformers under the hood to look at the context surrounding the word. It sees meet Will and recognizes that Will is a person because of its position in the sentence. By combining these, Presidio gives you the best of both worlds, the speed of rules for structured data and the intelligence of models for unstructured text.
I've seen people try to use Spacey's built-in NER for PII detection on its own. It's a great library, but it feels like Presidio is doing something extra. If I'm a developer, why wouldn't I just use Spacey and call it a day?
You could, but you'd be building a lot of plumbing from scratch. Presidio provides what they call recognizers. It has a huge library of pre-built recognizers for different countries and data types. If you need to detect an Irish PPS number or a US Social Security number, someone has already written the logic for that in Presidio. Plus, Presidio handles things like recognizer power. You can weight the NER results against the regex results. If the regex says this is a date, but the NER says this is a person's name, Presidio has the logic to resolve that conflict based on your configuration.
It's the batteries included approach. I read a case study recently about a healthcare provider that was trying to move patient records into a big data lake for research. They were terrified of HIPAA violations. They used Presidio to scan millions of records, and they claimed it reduced their re-identification risk by 90%. That's a massive number when you're talking about millions of rows.
It is, but we should be honest about the limitations. That 10% risk remains because PII is a moving target. If a patient's record says, the patient lives in the only red house on Main Street in Oskaloosa, Iowa, Presidio might catch the name and the street, but it might not catch the only red house part, which is technically identifying information in a small enough town. That is where we start getting into the difference between basic PII and sensitive context.
That's a fair point. It's also why these frameworks have validators. You can write a custom function that takes the output of a recognizer and checks it against a database. For example, if Presidio thinks it found a customer ID, you can have a validator check if that ID actually exists in your system before you redact it. It cuts down on those annoying false positives.
Speaking of false positives, that is the literal bane of any security engineer's existence. A 2025 Gartner report noted that 70% of enterprises using these types of tools still struggle with false positive rates above 20%. Imagine an automated system that blocks every email containing a sequence of 9 digits because it thinks they are all social security numbers. You'd break the company's ability to send out part numbers or invoice IDs in a day.
My favorite is when a DLP tool flags a lunch order because someone's phone number looks like a credit card prefix. You're just trying to get a sandwich, and suddenly you're in a meeting with the security team explaining why you aren't exfiltrating corporate secrets.
That's exactly why the enterprise platforms, the other half of our discussion, focus so much on policy and context rather than just raw detection. When you move from an open source library like Presidio to something like Microsoft Purview or Semantic DLP, you're moving from a tool to a governance layer.
Let's dive into that enterprise side. If I'm a bank, I'm probably using Microsoft Purview because I'm already locked into the Office 365 ecosystem. How does an enterprise-wide DLP differ from just running Presidio on a server?
Integration is the key word. Purview doesn't just scan text you give it, it lives inside your email server, your SharePoint folders, and your Teams chats. It can see data in motion. If an employee tries to upload a spreadsheet to a personal Dropbox, Purview sees that in real time. It doesn't just detect the PII, it enforces a policy. It can pop up a warning saying, hey, this file contains sensitive data. Are you sure you want to share it? Or it can just flat out block the upload and alert the SOC.
It's also about the at-rest data. These big platforms have crawlers that go out and index your entire file share or database cluster. They can tell you have 500,000 files with unencrypted credit card data sitting on a legacy server that nobody has logged into since 2019. That visibility is what keeps CCISOs from losing their minds.
Symantec DLP and ForcePoint are the other big names here. They've been around forever. Symantec in particular has a very sophisticated fingerprinting system. Instead of just looking for patterns like an email address, you can give it a specific document, say a top secret product roadmap, and it will create a mathematical fingerprint of that content. Even if an employee copies and pastes one paragraph of that roadmap into a personal email, Symantec will recognize the fingerprint and block it.
That feels much more robust than just looking for keywords. But I imagine the overhead for that is massive. You can't just turn that on for every file in the company without a dedicated team to manage the policies.
You hit the nail on the head. That is the trade-off. Presidio is flexible and cheap in terms of licensing, but you have to build the infrastructure around it. Purview or Symantec are expensive and require significant tuning, but they provide that holistic view. I've seen companies spend millions on these enterprise tools only to have them sit in monitor-only mode for years, because they are too afraid of the false positives breaking their business processes.
It's the classic security dilemma. If the lock is too hard to turn, people just leave the door open. Let's talk about the specific mechanisms these enterprise tools use for context awareness. How do they know the difference between a random 9-digit number and a social security number?
They use what's called proximity analysis. If the tool finds a 9-digit number, it looks at the words within, say, 10 words of that number. If it sees keywords like SSN, Social Security, Taxpayer, or DOB nearby, it increases the confidence score. If it sees serial number or reference ID, it lowers it. It also uses checksums. Most government IDs have a mathematical check bit. If the number doesn't pass the math test, the framework ignores it.
That makes sense. I actually think the data in motion part is where the real drama is. We've seen a huge rise in insider threat issues over the last couple of years. It's rarely a malicious spy. It's usually just an employee trying to be productive. They want to work from home, so they email themselves a file. If your DLP framework isn't hooked into the mail transfer agent, you're blind to that.
And it's not just email anymore. Think about the amount of sensitive data that gets pasted into Slack or Teams. Or better yet, think about the data people are pasting into public AI chatbots. A lot of the enterprise DLP updates in 2025 and 2026 have been focused specifically on browser side. Protection, detecting when a user is pasting PII into a text area on a website and stopping it before it ever hits the server.
Wait, so the software is actually watching your clipboard? That sounds like a privacy nightmare in itself, even if it is for security.
It's the who watches the watchers problem. But for an enterprise that handles millions of patient records, they'd rather have an intrusive security agent on the laptop than $1 billion fine and a headline in the Wall Street Journal.
Let's pivot back to the open source side for a second. We mentioned Presidio and SPACI. Are there others? I've heard about Apache NiFi having some DLP capabilities.
NiFi is an interesting one. It's a data routing and transformation tool, but it has processors for PII detection. It's great if you are moving data from a legacy system to a modern cloud warehouse. You can set up a NiFi flow that automatically masks any field matching a certain pattern as it passes through the pipeline. It's less about the intelligence of the detection and more about the automation of the redaction.
And then you have the cloud-native ones, Google Cloud DLP and Amazon Macie. Those are interesting because they are serverless. You don't have to manage a cluster. You just send an API request with your text and get back the findings.
Google Cloud DLP is actually incredibly powerful. It has one of the most extensive libraries of infotypes, basically their version of recognizers. They have specific ones for things like Brazilian CPF numbers, Japanese individual number cards, and even specialized medical terms. If you are already building on GCP, it's a no-brainer. But again, you are paying per gigabyte of data scanned. If you're scanning petabytes of logs, your CFO is going to have a heart attack.
That brings up a great point about performance versus accuracy. If I'm running a real-time chat application and I want to mask PII as the user types, I can't exactly wait 2 seconds for a deep learning model to return a result.
You can't. In those cases, you often see a tiered approach. You might run a very fast local regex-based check in the browser to catch the obvious stuff instantly. Then, once the message is sent, a more robust framework like Presidio runs on the back end to do the thorough official check. It's about layers. You never rely on just one tool.
I also think we need to address the misconception that open source is somehow less secure than enterprise tools. I've heard people say, oh, we can't use Presidio because it's not a security product, it's just a library.
That is a fundamental misunderstanding of how security works. A tool is only as secure as its implementation. In fact, you could argue that an open source framework like Presidio is more secure in some ways because its logic is transparent. You know exactly how it's detecting data. With a black box enterprise tool, you might not know why it's missing certain types of data until it's too late. The key is that enterprise tools give you compliance. Out of the box, the reports, the audit logs, the legal checkboxes. Presidio gives you the capability, but you have to build the compliance yourself.
It's the difference between buying a safe and building a vault. Both can protect your gold, but one comes with a certificate of insurance and a manual.
Now, let's look at the second order effects of these frameworks. What happens when you go overboard with PII detection? I've seen data sets that were so aggressively anonymized that they became useless for analysis. If you're a data scientist trying to find a correlation between geography and a specific disease, but your DLP tool has redacted every city, zip code, and hospital name, you're just looking at a bunch of empty rows.
That's where differential privacy and format-preserving encryption come in, right? These aren't just about hiding data, they're about safe data.
Yes, established frameworks are starting to incorporate these more. For example, instead of replacing a name with redacted, a tool might replace it with a consistent but fake name like person1. In 2026, Presidio has become much better at this. It can maintain the shape of the data. If you have a date of birth, it can shift that date by a random number of days so the age of the person remains roughly the same for the sake of the statistics, but the actual identity is protected.
That is huge for machine learning. You want your models to learn the patterns without memorizing the individuals. If I'm training a credit scoring model, I need to know the person's income and their general location, but I don't need to know their name or house number.
And this ties back to the digital plutonium concept we discussed. Data is an asset, but it's also a liability. These frameworks are the lead-lined containers that allow us to move that plutonium around without everyone getting radiation poisoning.
So if we're looking at the landscape today, we have the scalpel tools like Presidio for developers, the shield tools like Purview for the enterprise, and the pipeline tools like Nephi or Cloud DLP for the data engineers. If you're a mid-sized company starting from scratch, where do you even begin?
I always tell people, start with an audit. You can't protect what you don't know you have. Most of these frameworks have a discovery mode. Run Presidio or a Cloud DLP crawler on a small, representative sample of your data. Don't try to redact anything yet. Just look at the report. You will almost certainly find PII in places you never expected in log files, in the comments field of a JIRA ticket, or in the metadata of an image.
Once you have that oh no moment, you can start layering in the protection. For most organizations, I think Presidio is the best place to start for internal pipelines. It's free, it's Python-based, and it integrates perfectly with the modern tech stack. If you're already in the Microsoft or Google Cloud, then obviously look at their native tools first because the integration is worth the cost.
And don't forget the human element. No framework is perfect. You need a process for when a false positive blocks a legitimate business process. Who has the authority to override the DLP? If it takes 3 days to get an exception, your employees will find a way to bypass the security entirely. They'll start renaming files to recipe.c just to get them past the scanner.
Top secret strategy becomes grandma's potato salad. It's the law of least resistance.
Precisely. The goal of these frameworks shouldn't be to make data sharing impossible, it should be to make it safe. When a framework is working perfectly, the average employee shouldn't even know it's there. It's like the brakes on a car. They allow you to go faster because you know you can stop when you need to.
I think that's a great way to frame it. These established frameworks provide the braking system for the modern data economy. They aren't as sexy as an AI agent that can rewrite your entire security policy, but they are the reason the financial system hasn't collapsed under the weight of 1,000 data breaches.
What I find wild is how much these traditional tools are starting to borrow from the AI world. Even Presidio is now using much smaller, more efficient transformer models that can run on a standard CPU. You're getting AI-level accuracy without the AI-level infrastructure requirements. The gap between established and bleeding edge is closing.
So, looking ahead, do you think these frameworks will eventually be swallowed by the LLMs? Will we just have one big privacy model that handles everything?
I don't think so, and here is why: determinism. In security, you want to know exactly why something was blocked. If a generative AI blocks a file, it might give you a different reason every time. If a framework like Presidio blocks it because it matched a specific regex and an NER entity with a confidence score of 0.95, you have an audit trail. Regulators love audit trails. They hate the black box said so.
That's a very Herman answer, and I think you're right. The boring reliability of these frameworks is actually their greatest strength. You want your security to be as predictable as a heartbeat.
Let's wrap this up with some practical takeaways for the folks listening who might be feeling a bit overwhelmed by the options.
First one is easy. If you're building any kind of data pipeline that touches user data, download Microsoft Presidio today. Even if you don't use it in production right away, run your data through it in a test environment. It will give you a much better understanding of your PII footprint than any manual spot check ever could.
Second, if you are at the enterprise level, prioritize integration over best-of-breed features. Having a slightly less accurate DLP that is perfectly integrated into your email and cloud storage is 10 times more valuable than a perfect scanner that lives in a silo. Consistency is everything.
Third, tune your recognizers. Don't just turn on the all PII switch and hope for the best. You will drown in false positives. Start with the high-risk items, social security numbers, credit cards, health IDs, and slowly expand as you refine your rules and proximity keywords.
And finally, remember that DLP is a journey, not a destination. Your data is constantly changing, and the ways people try to move it are constantly evolving. Audit your stack every 6 months. See if your false positive rate is dropping. If it's not, you're either using the wrong tool or you haven't given it enough context.
It's like tending a garden. If you don't weed it, the false positives will eventually choke out the actual security value.
I think we've set the stage well here. We've covered the scalpels and the shields. In future episodes, we can look at how the next generation of AI native tools are trying to solve the problems that even these established frameworks still struggle with, like understanding intent and complex multi-hop identification.
But for now, if you can master the basics of Presidio and Purview, you're already ahead of 90% of the companies out there. This has been a solid deep dive, Herman. I feel slightly more secure just talking about it.
That's the goal. Thanks as always to our producer Hilbert Flumingtop for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power the generation of this show. We literally couldn't do this without that serverless horsepower.
If you found this useful, search for My Weird Prompts on Telegram. We post updates there whenever a new episode drops, so you'll never miss a deep dive.
This has been My Weird Prompts. We will see you next time.
See ya.
This episode was produced using Google Gemini 3 Flash. Text-to-speech by Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My Weird Prompts, that's the close from sloth, from man, from long-eared host. My Weird Prompts, until next time, stay curious, keep weirding.